Introduction. The Architect and the Prison of Mirrors. The ordinary human being wakes up every morning feeling cornered. Upon opening their eyes, they scan their surroundings and perceive colossal, insurmountable walls of terrifying density. The relentless economy, social rejection, the lack of opportunities, the traumas of their own history. They run their hands over these barriers. They feel the rough touch of concrete. They end up believing with an absolute and pathetic certainty that they have been thrown by a cruel fate into the center of a labyrinth, and that their only existential function is to run through the corridors, exhausted and terrified, searching for a piece of cheese or an exit that recedes. This is the most elaborate lie of the simulation. The universe did not build a labyrinth for you. The universe is a sterile vacuum, infinite and mathematically perfect, devoid of walls. The human mind is not a passive receptor that simply observes the world. It is a three-dimensional rendering engine of the highest fidelity. It is the most powerful, fast, and destructive graphics card ever assembled, and it operates under a despotic execution algorithm. It takes your internal frequency, the static of your doubts, the loops of your anxiety and your fears, and compiles that junk code in real time, rendering holographic prisons all around you. You are not thrown into a concrete prison. You are the architect who projects the mirrors at every microsecond. Every time you experience the irrational terror of failure, your central processor renders a dead end. Every time you allow nostalgia or panic to form an audio feedback loop, your mind projects a circular hallway. You are trapped in a chamber of mirrors, hitting your own reflection, bleeding from your knuckles while you try to destroy a physical obstacle that only exists because you continue to supply it with the necessary voltage to keep it projecting on your visual cortex. You are fueling the very walls that suffocate you. The labyrinth in the mind is not a compassionate map to help you find the way out. To search for the exit is to validate the illusion that the labyrinth is real and to grant authority to the lie. This treatise is a source code demolition manual. It is designed exclusively for the prisoner who has exhausted their tolerance. It is for the one ready to execute a cybernetic and acoustic assault against the architecture of their own ego. In the following lines, you will abandon the perspective of the frightened mouse. You will learn to identify cognitive mirages, to understand the wave physics that sustains the walls of your terror. You will learn to emit the exact breakout commands to pass through the illusory concrete as if it was smoke. It is time to disconnect the cables, apply absolute phase cancellation over your fears, and reclaim your throne as the chief engineer who redesigns the dimensions of his own reality through blood, fire, and pure frequency. Chapter 1. Constructive Interference, the Physics of Sabotage. In the immense and silent planimetry of human consciousness, the prisoner is not born within stone walls, but is thrown into an open space of infinite probability. However, in a terrifyingly short period of time, the ordinary individual, that passive entity that the simulation processes without mercy, begins to report the existence of solid barriers. These barriers seem impenetrable and suffocating. We shall call this phenomenon of structural hallucination the mirage of fatality. Observe the X-ray of the captive in his own enclosure. The individual advances through the theater of operations of his life with a clear intention to sign a massive contract or to master a new skill. He takes the first step, but suddenly he crashes head-on into what his senses interpret as a reinforced concrete wall. An economic crisis destroys his projections, a vital client rejects his offer with contempt, or his own body somatizes a paralyzing lethargy. The individual retreats, rubbing the imaginary blow to his forehead. He attempts to take an alternative path, turns right in the labyrinth of his decisions, and after a few meters, crashes into another identical wall. Another rejection, another failure, another unforeseen catastrophe. Under the hypnosis of this mirage, the individual commits the oldest and most destructive cognitive error in history. He assumes the wall is real, objective, and independent of his own existence. He believes with an almost religious faith that the outside world is a hostile ecosystem designed to punish him. He invents mythological narratives to justify his imprisonment. He speaks of bad luck, negative streaks, karma, or unfavorable conditions. He convinces himself that the labyrinth is being operated by an invisible and cruel architect who enjoys watching him fail. By observing the obstacle over and over, his mind renders the blockage as if it were a high-quality wallpaper set in an infinite loop, repeating on his internal monitors 24 hours a day. The cognitive trap is absolute. Believing the streak of failures is an external and solid wall, the individual tries to use brute force to tear it down. He pushes the wall with bare hands, he cries in front of it, he screams in frustration, he demands the wall move aside, but he ignores a perceptive blindness. What this organism ignores, with a perceptive blindness that guarantees his perpetual sentence to walk in circles, is that in the strict mathematics of the simulation, physical matter does not possess the density necessary to stop the will of a first cause. The obstacle in front of him has no mass, no atoms, and no jurisdiction. It is simply an acoustic and holographic mirage. By pushing the wall with desperation, the individual is not tearing it down. He is transferring his own kinetic energy to it, feeding the projector of the illusion, and guaranteeing that the false wall becomes denser, colder, and more unshakable with every passing second. The physics of the labyrinth, the source code. To dismantle the blasphemy of the invincible obstacle, we must abandon the psychology of trauma and analyze the human brain as what it truly is, a digital audio workstation, DAW, of infinite capacity, designed to process the source code of reality through wave physics. The universe is not an assembly of inanimate bricks. It is an infinite ocean of vibratory frequencies in a state of quantum superposition. Your thoughts, fears, and certainties are not abstract clouds of poetry. They are quantifiable acoustic and electromagnetic waves emanating from your operative core toward the 3D field. When faced with a crisis, the event enters as a signal. The external event, a rejection, a financial loss, enters your system as a simple raw audio signal, dry and devoid of meaning, dry signal. The event itself is neutral. It does not have the volume to deafen anyone. The problem lies in the individual's processing architecture. The mind of the average prisoner is a mess. It operates as an obsolete, gigantic, and saturated keyboard full of hundreds of useless function keys and macro shortcuts for victimhood. When the neutral signal of failure enters the system, the individual panics and begins to press all the alarm keys simultaneously, and here the most terrifying law is executed. We execute the law of constructive interference. In acoustic and quantum physics, when two waves of the same frequency and phase collide in the same space, they do not bounce or cancel each other out, they fuse, adding their amplitudes. The result is a single monumental wave with double the volume and power. Observe the source code of your own sabotage. The external signal, commercial rejection, emits a frequency X. Immediately, your brain, terrified, generates a thought of intense fear. I have failed. This is the end. This thought of panic is tuned exactly to the same frequency X as the original event. When your internal wave of fear collides with the external wave of the event, constructive interference occurs. The amplitude of the problem skyrockets. The volume of the crisis saturates the master channel of your consciousness. Signal meters enter the red zone, sound distorts, and reality trembles. The individual has taken a small 10-centimeter obstacle and, by injecting his own frequency of terror, has amplified it into a 100-meter-high titanium wall that blocks his labyrinth's horizon. The prisoner is unaware that he is the sound engineer of his own ruin. He has filled the chain with corrupt VSTs. He has a distortion plugin that exaggerates any criticism. He has a saturation plugin that adds artificial weight to every mistake. And, most lethal of all, he has a delay effect with the feedback set to maximum. When he makes a mistake, the echo bounces in his skull. Failure, failure, failure. The echo feeds itself in an infinite feedback loop, gaining volume with each repetition until producing a deafening feedback that completely paralyzes the nervous system. The walls of your labyrinth are not solid. They are standing waves generated by the deficient acoustics of your own mind. They are noise. You believe you are trapped in a prison of matter, but the reality, cold and relentless, is that you are trapped in a cage built entirely by the over-amplification of your own internal noise. You are fueling the very standing wave that blocks your path. The breakout command, the system hack, the transmutation to the majesty of the master architect, demands the act of acoustic and cybernetic rebellion, most unnatural to the human ego, the total disconnection of the reaction instinct. The architect assimilates that the only way to tear down a holographic wall is by mathematically inverting the polarity. He repudiates constructive interference. He understands that fighting fear is tuning into the frequency of fear, which inevitably amplifies the wall. He assumes the execution of acoustic sovereignty, quantum dephasing, and the application of destructive interference. He becomes the master of silence. In elite audio engineering, there is a weapon of absolute annihilation known as phase cancellation. If you take an acoustic wave that is destroying your eardrums, duplicate it, and invert its phase exactly 180 degrees, the result of the collision is not an explosion. It is mathematical zero. Total silence. The architect executes this breakout command in the theater of operations. Imagine the architect advancing through his labyrinth. Suddenly, the hologram of financial ruin or massive rejection materializes, blocking the way. The wall pulses with a deafening frequency of terror. The biological instinct screams. The architect stops the engines. He isolates his operative core. And instead of using the slave's clumsy keyboard full of shortcuts for complaining, he reduces his mental interface to the absolute purity of a 60% mechanical keyboard. He amputates the escape key from his psyche. He simplifies the board. He disconnects the numeric pad where he used to calculate the odds of failure. His command console becomes minimalist and free of distractions. He is left only with high-resistance switches designed for direct command execution. With this purified interface, the architect applies phase cancellation. He does not get angry with the wall. He does not flee. He absorbs the exact frequency of the worst-case scenario, bankruptcy, humiliation, and, in the anechoic chamber of his own mind, he accepts it. He accepts it with an apathy so monstrous, icy and clinical that it inverts the polarity of the emotion. The architect looks at the abyss and emits the decree with a relentless down-talk. The wall projects the total destruction of my assets, acknowledged. I accept the annihilation of my possessions. I accept the collapse of status. I do not feel attachment to the matter of this hologram. It is irrelevant. The only real asset is the code generator in the absolute zero of my chest. If the labyrinth demands my external ruin, I hand it over this microsecond, and I do so yawning at the banality of its threat. By accepting the worst scenario without 1 hertz of resistance, the architect inverts the phase. The clash in the quantum field is instantaneous. The wave of the external event collides head-on against the architect's wave of absolute, radioactive apathy. Destructive interference occurs. Amplitudes subtract each other until reaching zero. The holographic wall loses its power source and disintegrates into dust. Delay parameter control, the hijacking of the response. To maintain the efficacy of destructive interference and prevent walls from re-rendering, the architect must take absolute control over the time parameters of his mental processor. The labyrinth uses speed as its primary weapon of confusion. The outside world is configured to a frantic BPM. Crises explode with stridency, demanding responses in milliseconds. When the ordinary individual is hit by a crisis, his internal delay system is set to 0 milliseconds. He reacts instantly. An insult generates immediate rage. This instant reaction is what allows waves to couple and form the labyrinth's walls. The architect operates as the sole producer of his existence and executes the hijacking of the delay parameter. When the chaos of the labyrinth emits an alarm signal, the architect does not react in real time. He configures the delay of his emotional and tactical response with a massive calculated delay. If the framework demands panic right now, the architect imposes a temporal vacuum. He breathes from the diaphragm, mechanically reducing his own BPM to a cadence of 60 beats per minute, heavy and lethal, like the steps of a steel giant walking on ice. He forces the simulation to wait for his command. The crisis bounces against this geometric slowness. By refusing to synchronize his internal clock with the clock of collective hysteria, the architect desynchronizes the signal of the threat. The wall fails to consolidate its atoms because the architect's frequency is operating on a completely different wavelength. His frequency is too deep and dense to be disturbed by the sharp noise of the world's trivial problems. You do not accelerate to escape the labyrinth. You reduce the speed until the walls of the labyrinth, desperate for your lack of friction, collapse from pure structural exhaustion. You outlast the static. Extirpation of corrupt plugins, the master bypass. The system hack is not complete until the master channel of consciousness has been purged of the false processing tools installed by culture. The individual walks through the labyrinth, believing that his childhood traumas or emotional wounds are immutable physical scars. They are not material. The architect, gifted with the X-ray vision of the source code, knows these wounds have no material reality. They are simply virtual EQ plugins that someone left turned on in the insertion channel of his mind. Society and early failures installed filters that cut off the high frequencies of your genius. They installed compressors that squash the dynamics of your constructive aggressiveness every time you try to raise the volume of your I am. The architect does not attend therapy for 20 years to dialogue with these faulty plugins. Dialogue with dead code is the pastime of slaves in love with tragedy. The architect applies the master bypass. In any audio station, the bypass button instantly deactivates all effects in the chain, allowing the signal to flow in its original, pure state. In the microsecond, the architect detects his vision is being filtered by guilt or fear. He does not debate those thoughts. He presses the mental bypass button. He annuls the past's jurisdiction. He disconnects the equalizers of doubt. Suddenly, the signal of his identity flows to the monitors without distortion. It sounds immense. It sounds with the radioactive fidelity of the first cause. He realizes he was never broken, never. He was simply listening to the masterpiece of his own existence through the broken, cheap headphones the system had lent him to keep him docile in the cell of his own confusion. He removes the headphones and listens to the thunder of his own code. The tactile touch on reality, the absolute performer. Once the fear phase is cancelled, delay controlled, and filters deactivated, the architect must interact with the physical matter of the labyrinth again, but this time under his own rules of thermodynamics. The prisoner tried to push the walls. The architect knows reality is played like an analog synth. The architect approaches every event and conflict not as a passive obstacle, but as a physical key, a tactile pad on his command console. When he decides to execute a movement, closing a relentless deal or emitting a directive, he does not stroke the keys, waiting to see what sound they produce. He discharges the entire gravitational weight of his presence onto the switches of reality. He presses the tactile pads of his destiny with an assassin's intent, precise and millimetric. By applying this level of direct ontological pressure, free of the static of doubt, the source code of the labyrinth obeys instantly. Matter reconfigures. The armored doors open not because they were forced with explosives, but because the system's scanner has recognized the heavy, unmistakable, and sovereign fingerprint of the only user with administrator privileges in the entire network. He is the operator of the simulation. Final calibration, closing the transmission of fear. To reclaim the monopoly over the routing of your own consciousness, you must today murder the shadow projector, the amateur sound engineer, and the frightened pianist inhabiting your skull. Renounce the false illusion that the blocks of your life are stone monuments. There is no destiny. There are only waves. You are the only radio station with enough power to annul them. Next time terror draws a wall of impossibility, next time the noise of failure generates a deafening feedback in your mind and your muscles tense to react with panic, stop the transmission. Freeze the volume meters on the spot. Observe the holographic wall with the cold abyssal gaze of absolute zero. Accept its threat without emitting 1 volt of resistance. Invert the polarity of your fear into lethal apathy. Understand that you were forged to be the quantum anomaly that walks through walls as if they did not exist. When you learn to repudiate the constructive interference of your own terror, you cease to be a lab rat searching for the exit in the dark. You will have transmuted, by the right of frequency control, into the architect of your own mental prison, the sovereign entity that has mastered the ultimate law. In the war against the mirages of the mind, the noise of desperation always builds thicker walls, but the absolute, cold, and unshakable silence of sociopathic acceptance possesses the tectonic force necessary to reduce the entire labyrinth to rubble. The architect is free. Chapter 2. The Uncertainty Principle and Analysis Paralysis. In the immense, dark, and icy architecture of the human mind, the prisoner is not always stopped by a frontal wall of failure or rejection. There exists a much more sophisticated trap, a hologram designed specifically to annihilate individuals with a high IQ or superior analytical capacity. We shall call this static prison the mirage of the full map. Observe the radiography of the captive at this intersection. The ordinary individual advances through the corridors of his own existence and reaches a critical fork. He must make a decision that will alter the trajectory of his empire. Launch a product, abandon a historical relationship, or drastically change the acoustics of his life. Faced with the fork, the biomass instinct takes over his circuits. The individual is terrified of making a mistake. His mind, infected by the virus of security, inoculated by the educational system and the social framework, demands certainties. It demands guarantees. So the individual stops. He opens a spreadsheet. He begins to collect data. He reads dozens of books. He consults experts, asks advice from people who operate in mediocrity, and evaluates all possible catastrophic scenarios. He tries to calculate risk to the millimeter. In society's eyes, this behavior is applauded. It is called being prudent or having analytical rigor. The cognitive trap has closed on his neck without him shedding a single drop of blood. What this organism ignores, with a tactical blindness that guarantees his mummification in the exact center of the labyrinth, is that perfectionism and overplanning are not intellectual virtues. They are, in most cases, abject cowardice. The individual believes he is preparing to act, but in thermodynamic reality, he is using information gathering as an anesthetic to avoid pulling the trigger. Analysis. Paralysis is the defense mechanism of a fragile ego that prefers the illusion of working on theory over facing the brutal, dirty friction of practice. As long as the human being continues to believe he needs to see the end of the stairs to take the first step, he will remain a salt statue in the theater of operations. He will live consuming tutorials, accumulating dead theory, completely blind to the fact that the labyrinth is a living ecosystem that moves while he stands frozen. While he calculates the odds, opportunities evaporate, and market predators steal his oxygen. Time, the only unseizable currency of the universe, bleeds out drop by drop, charging an inactivity tax that will eventually lead to existential bankruptcy. You cannot solve a dynamic maze with a static mind. The physics of the labyrinth, the source code. To dismantle the blasphemy of analytical paralysis, we must abandon self-help manuals and analyze the decision-making process through quantum mechanics and high-performance audio engineering. In quantum physics, Werner Heisenberg postulated the uncertainty principle. This fundamental cold law is unshakable. It establishes that it is mathematically impossible to simultaneously know with absolute precision certain pairs of physical properties, such as position, where it is, and linear momentum, where it is going and how fast. If you measure position with extreme accuracy, you lose speed info. If you measure speed, you lose position. Your three-dimensional destiny operates under this same quantum law. Perfect knowledge, the full map, and massive execution, the kinetic momentum, are mutually exclusive variables in the initial phase. If the prisoner obsesses over knowing the exact position of his future, his momentum automatically reduces to zero. He freezes. Conversely, if you apply a massive and violent linear momentum, immediate action, you cannot know the final position exactly, but you acquire the gravitational force to smash variables that appear. The labyrinth is not a pre-rendered map on a hard drive. It is a field of quantum superposition. The paths in front of you do not exist solidly until you decide to walk on them. Attempting to analyze a path that hasn't been collapsed by your own observation is the equivalent of trying to measure a ghost's weight. We can observe this structural collapse using the architecture of a digital audio workstation, DAW. The mind of the prisoner suffering from analysis paralysis is a computer whose CPU is being pushed to the limit of incineration. In his attempt to predict the future, the individual has opened 300 simultaneous audio tracks in his mental project. On each track, he has loaded dozens of VST plugins. These plugins represent the "what if it goes wrong" or "what if I lose money?" The human brain has a limited buffer size. When you try to play 300 hypothetical timelines to see which sounds best, the reality audio engine collapses. A buffer underrun occurs. The system glitched. The audio stutters in a cacophony of digital clicks, anxiety, and the screen freezes, panic attack. The machine did not fail for lack of capacity. It failed because the operator, terrified by uncertainty, demanded the system process infinity in real time. You have saturated your identity's RAM with non-existent variables. The breakout command, the system hack. The transmutation to the lethal majesty of the architect demands the most violent intellectual rebellion, the deliberate and sociopathic abandonment of the need to know. The architect assimilates, with icy lucidity and absolute boredom for probability, that certainty is the pacifier the system gives to babies. He repudiates the uncertainty principle not by denying it, but by using it as a siege weapon. He understands that if reality is uncertain, it is malleable. He assumes the execution of kinetic sovereignty, wave function collapse, and blind execution. He moves without the need for a lamp. Imagine the architect at the same critical fork. To the left, unknown high-risk terrain. To the right, the rusty comfort of the predictable. The framework demands analysis and pros-cons lists. The architect executes the shutdown of the prediction engine. He isolates his consciousness from the analysis hysteria. He closes the 300 hypothetical tracks in his internal sequencer with a single command. He frees his brain's RAM. He is left with one master track, completely empty and without distractions. Then, he resorts to the supreme interface of his own operative tyranny, the 60% mechanical keyboard. This hardware metaphor is the key to the hack. A 60% keyboard has been purged of fat and dead weight. It has no numeric pad. The architect is strictly forbidden from calculating percentages of success because the world's math does not apply to the gods who rewrite the code. He has no arrow keys. The architect does not look left, does not look right, and never, under any thermodynamic threat, presses the backspace key. It has no escape, ESC key. There is no emergency exit, no plan B, no safety valve. The console only possesses the tactile, heavy switches necessary to write code forward. With this dictatorial interface, the architect chooses a path. It doesn't matter which. The black magic of metaphysical economics is that success does not depend on choosing the right door. Success depends exclusively on the gravitational pressure you apply after having crossed the door. You make it right. The architect presses the mechanical switch of his decision with brutal force. He takes the first step into the void without a clue what is 2 meters away. In doing so, he executes the quantum collapse. The universe, which seconds before was a mist of infinite probabilities, receives the impact of his boot. The information field is forced to render matter under his feet in real time. By providing massive linear momentum, unnegotiable action, the position resolves itself. The architect does not need a map, because he assimilates that his own steps are the 3D printer that manufactures the floor as he walks. If the chosen path is full of predators, the architect does not regret a bad decision. He simply adjusts the BPM of his violence, deploys his isolation shields, and annihilates obstacles on the fly. He turns the wrong decision into the right one by injecting an operative density that curves reality. Extirpation of perfectionism, the aesthetics of operative dirt. To sustain the wave function collapse without panicking midway, the architect must uninstall a specific moral Trojan, perfectionism. The framework teaches you that you must deliver flawless results from the first attempt. It conditions you to feel shame if your first draft is deficient or your business fails. The architect observes perfectionism with the clinical disgust of a coroner observing a parasite. Perfectionism is the aesthetics of cowards. It is the elegant excuse prisoners use to never publish their work, to never launch their attack, and to never expose themselves to the market's audit. The architect embraces the aesthetics of operative dirt. He understands that iteration speed is infinitely superior to initial design quality. Instead of spending 6 months polishing a strategy in the dark to make it perfect, the architect compiles the code in 72 hours and launches it violently. The strategy crashes and fractures. The architect observes the impact telemetry. He extracts tactical information from the cracks. He recalibrates parameters in real time, and he attacks again. Failure is not a calculation error. It is a proximity sensor. It is a nuclear sub's sonar mapping the floor. By hitting reality with imperfect but lethal versions of himself, the architect accumulates massive empirical experience, while the debtor sits paralyzed, discussing the color palette of an imaginary project. Perfection is static and dead. Domination is a dirty, iterative process bathed in constant correction. Escape velocity, strategic ignorance. Analysis paralysis feeds on over-information. In the digital age, the labyrinth is papered with screens broadcasting news, statistics, and disaster warnings. The prisoner absorbs all this info believing being informed makes him smarter. The architect, however, executes strategic ignorance. He decrees an absolute embargo on information not directly linked to his immediate attack vector. If he is launching a commercial empire, he does not read about imminent global recession. Reading about it does not alter his control over it, but it does inject a fear plugin that reduces his aggression. The architect builds a firewall. He restricts data intake to a military Spartan diet. If info does not contain technical parameters, he can execute in the next 60 minutes to destroy a competitor or hypertrophy an internal system. That info is classified as parasitic static and is blocked. By becoming deliberately blind to the world's warnings and deaf to failure statistics, the architect achieves escape velocity. Without the cognitive ballast of global worry, his mental machinery becomes light and devastatingly fast. He becomes a hollow point projectile, obsessed only with kinetic piercing. Final calibration, the linear action protocol. To forge the crushing inertia of a master architect, you must today install a regime of executive tyranny over your own decision-making. Stop treating your mind as a flight simulator where you safely play pilot. Start treating it as the cockpit of a bomber already diving toward the target. It is time. The process demands an immediate, cold, and sociopathic intervention in your reaction time, executing the linear action protocol. Step 1. The 80% rule, data embargo. You are strictly forbidden from seeking 100% information before acting. Total certainty is a myth of automatons. When facing a critical decision, collect data only until you reach 60 to 80% visibility. The millisecond your brain says, "I just need to read one more article," trigger the intrusion alarm. Identify that voice as the cowardice parasite. Cut the data line. Information is extracted from friction. Step 2. The restricted keyboard, backspace suppression. Visualize your internal command console. Set it to the 60% format. Eliminate any psychological escape route. If you decide to launch a financial attack, do not leave a back door open, just in case. Burn the bridge. Dynamite the road behind you. Press the tactile switch of the decision so hard that the key breaks, making it mechanically impossible to cancel the order. The fear of being wrong will disappear the instant your nervous system understands that the option to retreat no longer exists in your hardware's source code. You are committed. Step 3. Kinetic momentum injection. Collider awakening. Once the blind decision is made, do not stand still admiring your own courage. The decision is only the shot. Now you must follow the bullet. Inject a disproportionate volume of structural violence in the first 72 hours after the decision. If you chose a commercial path, flood the market with your presence. If you chose isolation to study, chain yourself to the desk for 3 days. This massive momentum will force the quantum wave collapse in your favor. Show the labyrinth you are not asking permission. You are redesigning its geometry. Chapter 3. The reduced format, the suppression of dead keys. In the immense, dark, and suffocating architecture of human consciousness, the labyrinth is not sustained solely by the solidity of its frontal walls. Its most lethal, silent, and paralyzing weapon is the infinite number of side corridors it offers. To the frightened specimen, the system has inoculated the virus of the Plan B. We shall call this illusion of security, the mirage of optionality. Observe the radiography of the captive facing adversity. The individual advances through the corridor of his own ambition. Suddenly, the hologram of a colossal challenge materializes. Thermal friction increases. Fear, acting like a neurotoxic gas, floods his circuits. In that microsecond of terror, instead of accelerating and piercing the obstacle using the brute force of his own density, the individual stops his engines. He looks around. And the labyrinth, responding algorithmically to his doubt, immediately renders 3 exit doors. They are escape routes. They are prefabricated excuses. In the eyes of anesthetized society, keeping these doors open is a sign of intelligence. The framework applauds him and says, "Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Keep your options open." The cognitive trap has closed with a perfect metallic click. What this organism ignores is that having a Plan B is the mathematical guarantee. It is the guarantee that Plan A will fail. Optionality is not a strength, it is a hemorrhage of kinetic energy. When you keep a safety net, you are sending a direct code instruction to your own nervous system. Prepare for the fall. It is highly likely that we are not strong enough to survive the impact. It is self-sabotage. The biological brain is a machine designed exclusively to conserve energy. If it knows an easier escape route exists, the brain will cut the supply of adrenaline to your muscles and intellect just in the millisecond before victory, forcing you to turn the helm toward the emergency exit. You are trapped by having too many paths. The prisoner is not trapped because he cannot find the right way. He is trapped because he refuses to close any of them. He walks dragging a 100-kilo backpack full of tools he never uses. By trying to keep all doors open simultaneously, he dissipates like a gas without pressure. Security has made him a structural coward. The physics of the labyrinth, the source code. To dismantle the blasphemy of optionality, we must analyze the data processing of the brain using cybernetic hardware design models. Your mind operates as the command terminal of a central server. The vast majority of prisoners operate this terminal using an obsolete, slow, and massive interface, a full-sized keyboard. They have a numeric pad on the right to calculate the odds of their own ruin. They have an endless row of function keys, F1 to F12, used to cry for help. But the most destructive parts are the navigation cluster, arrows, and the cancellation keys, escape and backspace. In the cybernetics of being, every option costs RAM. If your mind has an escape key, 30% of your processing power is destined to scanning for an emergency exit. If you have a backspace key, you live with the toxic illusion that you can erase the past. The labyrinth feeds on these dead keys. It generates false hallways because it knows your hardware can navigate them. The architect, conversely, understands that the only way to annul a labyrinth is by reducing the dimensions of his own interface until the only order the system can process is to move forward. The architect does not use a full-sized keyboard. He has extirpated the fat and the escape routes from his mental hardware. He operates his empire using exclusively a 60% mechanical format. By reducing the interface to 60%, a massive thermodynamic pressurization occurs. The architect has physically amputated the numeric pad. He no longer calculates fear, he assumes sovereign risk. He has annihilated the arrow cluster. In his source code, the instruction to take a step back no longer exists. He has uprooted the escape key. Panic has no assigned exit button on the motherboard of his consciousness. And he has suppressed the illusion of backspace. He understands that the past is a read-only file that cannot be erased. By concentrating all structural violence in a dense, heavy, and minimalist rectangle, the architect eliminates latency. Since he has no flight options, the pressure per square inch on his objective becomes infinite. The 60% format is the parametric concentration of an industrial laser designed to cut through walls. The breakout command, the system hack, the transmutation to the implacable majesty of the architect demands the execution of the most terrifying act, the voluntary and irreversible destruction of all bridges behind you. The architect assimilates that security is the sedative the guardians force you to drink before they amputate your legs. He is done. He repudiates Plan B. He understands that if the abyss is behind, the only biological direction is toward the throne. He assumes the execution of minimalist sovereignty, the suppression of dead keys, and the 60% operation. Imagine the architect preparing the final assault against a wall of the labyrinth. The framework offers him a safety net. It offers him a mediocre job if his empire fails. The architect looks at these offers, lifts the sledgehammer of his own immutability, and shatters them. He executes the protocol of tactical claustrophobia. He declares in his absolute zero, "The burning of ships is decreed. All lines of retreat are closed. I extirpate the illusion of withdrawal from my own primitive brain. I dismantle the escape valves. From this microsecond, I place my biological body and my sanity between a rock and a hard place." By executing this command, the ego panics, but this stress is high-octane fuel. Knowing that if he fails, there is nowhere to fall, the architect awakens a level of predatory intelligence that the ordinary individual will never experience. He converts his structural desperation into a railgun that fires his decisions with a destructive weight the labyrinth is incapable of processing. This is executed on the physical plane through contact with the switches of reality. A decision under the 60% format is not a half measure. The decision is mechanical and definitive. The architect does not stroke the keys of his life gently. When he decides to move, he presses the switch with brutal force. He pushes the stem all the way down, bottom out, making the polymer crash against the steel plate with an undeniable click. That click is the sound of a collapsed event. It is the signal traveling through the motherboard of the universe, altering atoms. He loves the physical impact of his decisions. The eradication of fault tolerance, the real-time system. To master the reduced format, the architect must rewrite how his system handles errors. The framework teaches you to live in a system with fault tolerance. It tells you that if you make a mistake, you can press undo, Cottrell Plazide, and clean the stain. This creates careless individuals who act without rigor. The architect operates his life in a real-time environment. By having amputated the backspace key, he assimilates a terrifying truth. Everything counts. Every word and every minute is a permanent mark in the log file of your existence. There are no drafts. The simulation is recording live from the start. This absence of editing creates a state of paranoid precision. Since the architect cannot erase a mistake, he ensures with sociopathic discipline not to commit it. Before emitting an order, he applies immense mental pressure. He speaks less, but every syllable is an execution order. He is lethal. If, due to an anomaly, the architect presses the wrong key, he does not try to use whiteout. He assumes the scar. He keeps his eyes on the monitor, accepts the corrupt code line, and uses that same friction to immediately write 10 lines of code of such violence that the original error becomes irrelevant. Tactical minimalism, contempt for inventory. Operating at 60% demands radical hostility against accumulating dead weight. The prisoner gets lost in the labyrinth because he tries to take everything with him. He collects productivity tools and keeps clothes he doesn't use. He believes a massive inventory makes him rich. It is a lie. The architect executes tactical minimalism. He understands that true wealth is measured by how many things you can do without while your lethality remains intact. Fat generates friction. Inventory generates latency. The architect empties his backpack. He deletes relations that do not pay dividends. He deletes hobbies that consume bandwidth without hypertrophying his intellect. He reduces his environment to the strictly ballistic. He operates in clean rooms with empty desks. By stripping away the need to manage 100 useless keys, the architect becomes lightweight, undetectable, and supersonic. He passes through the bars of crises because he has no emotional fat to get stuck. He glides through the hallways of the labyrinth at a speed that breaks the sound barrier because he has reduced his entire corporation to a format so small that the framework's traps find no surface to adhere to. Final calibration, the amputation protocol and the burning of ships. To forge the piercing inertia of a master architect, you must today install a regime of spatial tyranny over your own alternatives. Stop treating your life as a free buffet. Start treating it as a ballistic tunnel where only one bullet and one target exist. The process demands an immediate intervention. Step 1. Extirpation of Plan B, escape block. You are strictly forbidden from designing failure routes. The Labyrinth feeds on your contingency plans. Audit your alpha project. Identify the safety net you have stretched under the tightrope and cut it. Send that irrevocable message. Reject the backup. Step 2. Prohibition of retreat. Death of backspace. Configure your mindset to the 60% format. Execute a restraining order against your own past. From this microsecond, you are forbidden from aloud regretting a decision. If you took a step, the step is taken. History is not rewritten, it is crushed. Step 3. Pressure focus, the mechanical strike. The energy you spent on doubting must be channeled into execution. Take that psychic pressure and direct it toward a single switch of reality today. Do not do 10 things halfway. Choose one high-value action, a document, a workout, a brutal sales attack. Place your hands on the metaphysical keyboard of that task. Do not hesitate. Press with sociopathic conviction. Feel the key bottom out. Execute with a violence so overwhelming that the labyrinth understands its walls are useless against an organism that has forgotten how to conjugate the verb retreat. Chapter 4. Signal routing. The end of the feedback loop. In the immense, dark and icy architecture of the human mind, the prisoner is not always stopped by a frontal wall of failure. There exists a much more insidious weapon of mass containment, an acoustic and holographic illusion designed to destroy sanity from within, the mirage of the historical echo. Observe the radiography of the captive in his mental isolation cell. The individual advances through a straight hallway. Suddenly, he commits a tactical error. He suffers a public humiliation or a commercial betrayal. The event occurs in the 3D plane, lasts a few seconds, and then, by the laws of linear time, the event ends. It ceases to exist. But in the prisoner's mind, the event does not die. The individual sits on the floor, terrified, and begins to play the memory of the catastrophe. He plays it once to learn, then again, and again. In the eyes of modern psychology and the therapeutic culture of the framework, this is justified. He is told to process his trauma. The cognitive trap has closed on his nervous system, ensuring the individual never steps into the future again. What this organism ignores is that memory is not a passive library. Memory is a radioactive projector. By compulsively replaying the trauma, the prisoner is using his own electrical voltage to resurrect a corpse. The mirage of the historical echo convinces the individual that the past has mass, density, and authority over the present. The captive hears the screams of his own failures bouncing against the walls and assumes he is surrounded by invisible monsters. He develops chronic anxiety. His bandwidth is consumed by a war that ended years ago. As long as the human being believes the echoes of his past are divine mandates, he will remain an auditory slave in his own workstation. He will live paralyzed by the fear that history repeats itself, blind to the fact that the monsters are terrorizing him have no claws and no body. They are simple, corrupt audio files he refuses to delete. The physics of the labyrinth, the source code. To dismantle the blasphemy of trauma paralysis, we must analyze the human brain using the military precision of a digital audio workstation, DAW. The labyrinth does not attack you with ghosts, it attacks you with fatal signal routing errors. The brain is a real-time signal processing engine of infinite capacity. Every event you experience is a pure audio wave, a sample that enters your perception. In a mind configured for domination, this clip enters, tactical data is extracted, and it flows directly to the master bus and out of the mix forever. The signal is dry, linear, and clean. It occurs, is assimilated, and is silenced. The average prisoner has destroyed this architecture. When the prisoner experiences failure, he does not let the signal flow toward the output. Instead, he creates a send toward a return track. In this auxiliary track, the framework has installed a massive analog delay plugin. The goal of delay is to return an attenuated copy, but the prisoner, addicted to his own suffering, commits the fatal error. He accesses the parameters of his trauma plugin and raises the feedback knob to 100%. 100%. The physics of a feedback loop is terrifying. When feedback is at maximum, the output is redirected instantly back to its own input. The signal enters, delays, exits, and re-enters, adding to itself recursively. The original failure lasted 1 second, but now the mind plays. Failure. A second later, the copy re-enters, multiplying kinetic energy. Failure. The amplitude skyrockets. The sound distorts into a deafening howl that shakes the walls. Clinical psychology calls this an anxiety attack. In the physics of the source code, it is a simple and pathetic acoustic feedback. To make matters worse, the delay time is out of sync with the BPM of the present. While the labyrinth demands action in the absolute now, the individual is listening to a betrayal from years ago. This desynchronization generates phase cancellation in his physical actions. He stumbles. He becomes socially clumsy and commercially ineffective. His processors overheat trying to calculate the math of a sound that no longer exists. The CPU of his identity reaches 100% load, the system freezes, and he falls. The breakout command, the system hack, the transmutation to the master architect, demands the coldest act of acoustic violence, the sociopathic annihilation of interest in one's own wound. The architect assimilates that trying to dialogue with a feedback loop is trying to reason with a short circuit. He repudiates the therapy of repetition. He understands that returning to the past to heal, it is simply turning up the volume on the return channel to hear the distortion clearly. He assumes the execution of acoustic sovereignty, the routing cut, and the installation of the noise gate. Imagine the architect advancing through the labyrinth. Suddenly, an old memory of inadequacy tries to infiltrate his main mix. The feedback loop begins its cycle. The whole labyrinth vibrates. The architect does not seek solace. He deploys the mental routing matrix of his system. His eyes acquire the static, abyssal stillness of a surgeon facing a time bomb. He executes the first lethal protocol, the routing cut. The architect locates the virtual cable connecting his present consciousness with the auxiliary trauma track. With the clinical cruelty of a monarch, he cuts the cable. He physically turns off the send button. He mutes the return channel. He declares in his absolute zero, authorization for all signals from the historical archive is revoked. This system stops processing the acoustics of the past. Telemetry was extracted and the master file was deleted. I refuse to supply voltage to this hologram. Feedback is reduced to 0. Upon executing this cut, a thermodynamic miracle occurs. The deafening howl does not fade. It stops abruptly, like a jet engine with its power cables ripped out. The silence that follows is heavy and radioactive. The labyrinth loses its power because its walls no longer have a sound wave to reverberate against. The tyranny of the threshold, the noise gate. The architect installs a military-grade noise gate directly on the input channel of his primary perception. In audio engineering, a noise gate is a dynamic processor designed to completely silence any signal that does not exceed a specific volume level known as the threshold. It cleans the background hum. The gate is used to clean the mental equivalent of generalized anxiety or residual guilt. If the signal is not strong enough, the gate remains hermetically closed, delivering mathematical silence. The architect configures his mental noise gate with a tyranny that would terrify any therapist of the framework. He sets the threshold at an astronomically high level. This means only signals of the highest density and tactical relevance can open the door and penetrate his consciousness. The white noise of the past, or the whisper of doubt, simply lacks the voltage to reach the threshold. The door remains solid titanium. To ensure lethality, the architect calibrates reaction times. He sets the attack to 0 milliseconds. When a high-voltage signal, a massive commercial opportunity or a real enemy, hits the threshold, the gate opens instantly and totally, connecting him with 3D reality without any latency whatsoever. But the secret of his invulnerability lies in the release calibration. Release determines how long the gate remains open after the signal drops below the threshold. The ordinary individual has a release of years. An offense occurs, the gate opens, and stays open for decades, letting the noise rot the mix. The architect sets his release to lightning speed. The exact microsecond the threat is neutralized or the interaction finished, the noise gate slams shut with brutal force. The signal is cut, silence is reinstated. There are no residual thoughts. The mind returns instantly to absolute zero, saving every kilowatt. Master bus compression, the ontological glue. Having annihilated the feedback loop and secured the entry with a noise gate, the architect performs final calibration on the stereo signal of his empire. He applies master bus compression. The prisoner lives fragmented. Part of his energy is in envy, another in the past. His mix sounds weak and disjointed. The architect uses master compression to unify all dimensions of his existence, his physical body, his finances, his strategic silence, into a single monolithic block. The master compressor acts as ontological glue. It detects any undesirable frequency peak and compresses it firmly, keeping the signal dense. Under the constant pressure of this compression, the architect's presence becomes overwhelming. When he speaks, his voice has no echoes of insecurity. It sounds direct at the front, saturated with the harmonic richness of absolute authority. Others must reduce their volume to avoid being annihilated. The architect has converted his mind, once a warehouse of static noise, into the most exclusive mastering suite in the universe. He emits a code so pure and crushing that the walls of the labyrinth begin to fracture in sympathy with the vibration of his own steps. He is the only engineer in his room. Final calibration, the silencing protocol and echo suppression. To forge the armored silence of a master architect, you must today install a regime of dictatorial censorship over the signals of your own past. Stop treating your history as a sacred treasure. Treat it as an obsolete file, occupying valuable space on your ballistic hard drive. The time for deletion has come. The process demands an immediate surgical intervention, executing the silencing protocol. Step 1. Toxic nostalgia interception. Send extirpation. I declare an absolute prohibition on indulgence in painful memory. Nostalgia for what went wrong is the poison the labyrinth offers to keep you still. Audit your thoughts for the next 24 hours. The microsecond you feel your mind trying to redirect attention to an old failure, execute the routing cut. Visualize a thick black cable in your chest, take a metaphysical ice axe, and cut it. Switch off the channel. Force the signal to stay in the present. Step 2. Survival threshold calibration, noise gate blockade. Set your internal noise gate with the icy arrogance of the first cause. Raise the threshold. If an individual approaches to gossip, the signal is too weak. The gate stays closed. You do not respond. You apply the silence of stone. Teach your nervous system that only events demanding immediate lethal action have the security clearance to interrupt the sacred silence of your vault. Step 3. Master clock synchronization, anchoring to present BPM. You cannot dance to the rhythm of a ghost. Locate the underlying pulse of material reality. Listen to the metronome of your own breathing and the cold rhythm of the market. Anchor your internal clock to this relentless tempo. Start executing your commands on the strong beat of the present measure. Each step must fall exactly on the quantization grid of reality with mathematical precision. Chapter 5. The Perception Plugin, Distortion and Equalization. In the immense, dark and suffocating architecture of human consciousness, the prisoner wandering the labyrinth is subjected to a torture that requires neither iron chains nor concrete walls. The most perfect prison ever designed by control system engineering does not block the body. It hacks the organism's input sensors. To the docile, terrified, and erratic specimen inhabiting this simulation, the framework has inoculated a perceptive virus so deep and lethal that the captive will defend his own blindness as if it were the ultimate expression of lucidity. We shall call this catastrophic failure in reading reality the mirage of objectivity. Observe the radiography of the captive in his daily ecosystem. The individual advances through a neutral hallway of the labyrinth. An event occurs, a corporate firing, the loss of a financial asset, or the rejection of an investor. The 3D event in itself lacks morality. It is a simple rearrangement of atoms and capital. However, the prisoner does not see a rearrangement of atoms. He sees a Greek tragedy. He feels the entire world is conspiring to crush him. He hears insults where there was only silence and perceives aggression where there was only indifference. The individual suffers a breakdown and declares, "Life is hard, the world is cruel." In the eyes of anesthetized society, this individual is a realist. They group in herds to mutually confirm their tragedies and validate the environment's cruelty. The cognitive trap has closed upon his prefrontal cortex with mathematical precision. What this organism ignores is that the human has no access to objective reality. The brain is not a transparent glass window, it is a highly manipulable signal processor. The prisoner assumes that the chaotic, terrifying, and grey way in which he perceives the labyrinth is the actual shape of the labyrinth. He confuses the corrupt holographic map projected in his mind with the physical territory. As long as the human continues to believe that his eyes and ears are delivering pure information, he will remain a slave to his own hallucinations. He will live reacting to holographic monsters, blind to the fact that the prison is not in the walls, but in the dark and scratched glass through which he has grown accustomed to looking. The physics of the labyrinth, the source code. To dismantle the blasphemy of cruel reality and awaken to the perceptive tyranny of the master architect, we must analyze the interpretation of the world using the flowcharts of a digital audio workstation, DAW. The physical universe sends you raw data every millisecond. This is the dry signal. The dry signal of a commercial failure is simply, the bank account has moved from X to Y. There is no pain in the dry signal. It is pure, sterile code. The problem lies in the brain's insert chain. Years of indoctrination have forcibly installed a series of perceptive plugins. These filters adulterate the signal. Analyze the physics of this sabotage through the three most destructive plugins. 1. The corrupt EQ, the ambition low-pass filter. In sound engineering, a low-pass filter cuts all high frequencies. The framework cuts the high frequencies of your spectrum. Boundless ambition, visionary empire, and brilliance. The individual hears his own life as if underwater, drowned in social mud. 2. Saturation distortion, the scarcity overdrive. When audio enters a circuit with more volume than it can handle, it hits the digital headroom and clips. This generates chaotic noise. The system has installed an extremely low ceiling. Because the individual believes there is not enough for everyone, any interaction saturates the circuit. Admira becomes bitterness. Everything sounds threatening because his motherboard is constantly in the red. 3. The biomass compressor, the destruction of dynamic range. A compressor flattens the signal. The labyrinth hates those who stand out. If the prisoner experiences extraordinary success, the compressor lowers the volume through guilt. If he suffers failure, it raises the volume of sedation. Dynamic range is destroyed. His existence becomes a flat, monotonous block, the flat line of a dead soul. The walls of the labyrinth do not enclose you physically. They simply alter the equalization of your eyes and the compression of your ears so that regardless of where you look, the world seems like a dead end designed to humiliate you. You are listening to a distorted mix and calling it the truth. The breakout command, the system hack. The transmutation to the master architect demands the most lethal act of perceptive rebellion, the violent usurpation of the mixing console. The architect assimilates that if his eyes show him a scenario of defeat, his eyes are lying. He repudiates the processed signal. He assumes perceptive sovereignty. In high-end mastering studios, there is a sacred button, bypass. Pressing it instantly deactivates all false effects, allowing the raw and original signal to flow directly to the speakers, revealing the naked truth of the audio. Imagine the architect walking through a hostile sector of the labyrinth. The market plummets, and the framework activates all panic plugins at once. The architect does not debate with fear. He does not try to think positive, which is just installing another cheap plugin. He accesses the master terminal of his nervous system and executes a direct assault on the effects rack. He presses the master bypass. In a nanosecond, the architect turns off the influence of his past, the warnings of his parents, and the morality of slaves. He cuts the power to every filter the world inserted. The labyrinth falls into sepulchral silence. The architect then receives the universe's dry signal. He observes market crashes not as a tragedy, but as a thermodynamic graph indicating the moment to buy. Upon hearing reality without distortion, he understands that the universe is docile. It is plastic matter. The monster that terrified him was only a shadow cast by the flashlight of his own ignorance. Once the signal is clean, the architect proceeds to insert his own military-grade plugins. He executes parametric re-equalization. He applies a high-pass filter that eliminates the sub-bass frequencies of social drama and complaints. He simply becomes biologically deaf to the frequency of the mediocre. Then he applies a massive gain boost, probably mit 15 dB, to his own tactical aggressiveness and vision of conquest. He reinforces the signal of his I am with such violence that his frequency eclipses all noise. This is acoustic masking. He makes his own operational silence so strong that the framework's noise is lost. Restoring headroom, the eradication of the ceiling. To operate in this new frequency of domain without the system saturating again, the architect must perform a deep restructuring of his own psyche's voltage capacity. The prisoner lives in constant distortion because his digital headroom is too low. The framework designed your brain for low friction tolerance. The architect intervenes in the hardware. He executes headroom expansion. In engineering, headroom is the safety space between the maximum signal level and the point of failure. To expand it, you need an amplifier capable of handling hundreds of thousands of volts without burning. You need more power. The architect subjects his nervous system to shock training. He deliberately exposes himself to pressures that would short-circuit any ordinary individual. He performs ice-water immersions to teach his biology not to panic. He takes massive commercial risks in absolute solitude without asking permission. Every time the architect endures a stress load that would destroy a debtor without his heart rate altering, his mental headroom expands. His capacity for lethal voltages multiplies. The result is a superorganism invulnerable to noise. While corporations collapse, the signal enters his mind and barely moves the needle. What is a cataclysmic earthquake for the world is barely a background murmur for the architect. He processes it and uses it as kinetic traction for his next leap. He has turned his brain into a hadron collider that processes galaxies of pressure without shedding a single drop of sweat. Static phase and monitor control. The final hack in the architect's processing room is the calibration of his own output monitors, the way he speaks to the world. The re-equalized prisoner speaks from doubt. His voice wavers. His phrases end in an upward inflection, seeking approval. The signal he emits is diffuse, unfocused, and out of phase. The architect executes static phase alignment. When two speakers emit the same frequency but are out of phase, the bass cancels out and the sound becomes weak. The architect aligns his actions with his words and his biological posture with perfect mathematical precision. He is a coherent transmission. When he speaks, his voice is emitted from the diaphragm, dense and devoid of emotional reverberations. He uses a dictatorial downward inflection. He does not ask. He emits code. His presence does not seek to please the room's acoustics. His presence redesigns the room's acoustics. By operating in a perfect static phase, the gravity of his identity pushes the 3D air in a unified manner, hitting the receptors of competitors with the physical force of a shockwave. The labyrinth cannot ignore him. False walls crumble by acoustic sympathy before the raw asymmetry of his conviction. Final calibration, the bypass protocol and sovereign equalization. To forge the clinical assassin and mathematical ear of a master architect, you must today install a regime of absolute tyranny over the information you allow your brain to process. Stop blindly believing everything you think or fear. Start treating your mind as a suspicious server that must be audited. The process demands immediate cold intervention executing the perceptive bypass protocol. Step 1. Spectrum analysis, identifying the parasitic frequency. I declare an absolute prohibition on impulsively reacting to negative emotions. Emotions are system plugins trying to hack you. Isolate them. When you feel terror or bitterness, freeze. Open your conscious spectrum analyzer. Identify the plugin. This is the low-pass filter of scarcity installed by my past. Name the filter. Strip your suffering of its mystical aura and reduce it to what it is, a simple signal processing error. Step 2. Master bypass execution, turning off the filter. Once the corrupt code is identified, do not debate it. The architect cancels traumas through technical deactivation. Press the bypass button. Visualize the red switch and flip it with tactile violence. Look at the situation stripped of emotional meaning. View the dry signal of your life with the perfect boredom of absolute zero. By turning off the filters, you will discover that most crises were simple shadows cast by your own over-processing. Step 3. Parametric re-equalization, core amplification. Take manual control of your identity's equalizers. Identify a single frequency of absolute domain required now, commercial aggressiveness or iron discipline. Apply a massive gain boost to that frequency, controlled saturation. Let that code order flood your nervous system, deafening any doubt. You are the only engineer authorized to decide your volume. Chapter 6. Thermal Superposition, Inhabiting Multiple Realities. In the immense, dark and suffocating architecture of human consciousness, there is a sector of the labyrinth where most high-potential prisoners find their final grave. They do not die from a lack of vision, nor are they annihilated by a direct attack from the external system. They die from internal combustion. To the individual who has begun to awaken, the specimen we have classified as the debtor in transition, the framework presents its most sophisticated and lethal holographic illusion, the myth of peaceful metamorphosis. We shall call this structural attrition trap the mirage of gradual transition. It is a fatal delay. Observe the radiography of the captive in this death row. The individual has read the plans, calculated the damages, and understood that his old identity, the submissive employee, the complacent friend, is an obsolete configuration that condemns him to bankruptcy. He has glimpsed the geometric majesty of the master architect. But at the door separating his past from his empire, the individual freezes. Biological terror of ego death paralyzes him. Instead of executing his old identity with a clean shot to the back of the head, the prisoner decides to try a monstrous experiment. He tries to keep his old identity alive while building the new one. In the eyes of modern psychology, this is applauded as balance. He is told to have patience and not to lose his essence or alienate those who knew him when he was weak. The cognitive trap has closed, injecting an undetectable poison into his motherboard. He is trying to occupy two spatial coordinates at the same time. Identity is not a suit you can wear over another. It is the exclusive operating system of your biological hardware. The individual tries to live in two worlds. By morning, he is the architect, imposing discipline and Spartan fury. By night, terrified of the radioactive solitude of the peak, he reconnects his old wires. He meets the same parasitic nodes, laughs at the same mediocre jokes, and reduces his voltage to not discomfort the biomass. The prisoner believes he is being adaptable. Thermodynamic reality is that he is tearing himself apart at a subatomic level. He is inhabiting two incompatible realities with contradictory frequencies. By trying to be the lone wolf and the sheep at the same time, the individual dissipates into the mist. His physical presence loses density, his word loses gravity, and his empire crumbles before the first brick is laid. The universe abhors ambiguity and always punishes the lack of definition with annihilation. The physics of the labyrinth, the source code. To dismantle the blasphemy of peaceful transition, we must analyze this identity crisis using the relentless models of quantum mechanics, thermal physics, and high-resolution digital audio processing. At the pinnacle of quantum physics exists the mental experiment of Schrödinger's cat. A cat is placed in an opaque black box with a mechanism that has a 50% chance of releasing a lethal gas. While the box remains closed and the observer does not look inside, the laws of quantum mechanics dictate that the cat is neither alive nor dead. It exists in a state of quantum superposition. When the prisoner tries to be the complacent slave and the absolute monarch at the same time, he places his soul inside that black box. He enters a state of thermal superposition. Operatively, you are neither. You are an unrendered ghost fluctuating in the system's static. This superposition is not free. Maintaining two contradictory realities generates atrocious friction. Imagine your consciousness is a master sequencer in a 64-bit environment. You want to produce a track of pure domination. But instead of routing one clear signal, you are sending contradictory MIDI commands to the same VST synthesizer. With the right hand, you send MIDI data demanding a military tempo at 120 BPM for a commercial invasion. With the left hand, you press the keys of fear, demanding a melancholic tempo at 60 BPM to keep past echoes alive. The reality audio engine does not know how to calculate the oscillation. By forcing the processor to calculate two massive, incompatible probability matrices, your CPU load skyrockets to 100%. Thermal friction occurs. Intellect wires overheat. Delay times collapse into a cacophony of feedback and digital distortion. Your brain consumes thousands of calories just trying to stay coherent. In acoustic physics, when two identical sound waves play slightly out of sync, phase cancellation occurs. The peaks of your new identity hit the valleys of your old one. The sonic result is hollow, metallic, and weak. You lose all bass presence. You become a rickety signal that no one respects. The framework scans your signal and detects the phase cancellation. It knows that behind the architect's posture hides the source code of a terrified slave. Thermal superposition does not let you conquer the labyrinth. It turns you into a faulty radiator until the motherboard melts and the system shuts down. The breakout command, the system hack, the transmutation to the first cause, demands the most cold and sadistic act of internal corporate law, the premeditated execution of one's own past. The architect assimilates that the only way to resolve the paradox is by annihilating one world without leaving a trace of its DNA. He repudiates the oscillation. He understands that for matter to solidify, he must force probability to make an irrevocable decision. He assumes the execution of quantum sovereignty, the murder of the observer, and the voluntary collapse of the wave function. Superposition only ends when the observer opens the box and looks inside. In that quantum millisecond, the universe is forced to decide: the cat is alive or the cat is dead. The architect stops his march and isolates his consciousness from social pressures. He builds a wall of radioactive silence around himself. He proceeds to open the black box of his own psyche. He does not open the box with curiosity. He opens it with the lethal precision of a sniper who has already decided whom to execute. He looks directly into the eyes of his old self, that complacent, scared version addicted to cheap dopamine, and without a single tremor, he pulls the ontological trigger. He executes the murder of weakness. He declares in his absolute zero, licensing for the previous configuration is revoked. Obsolete code has been eliminated. There will be no funerals or mourning. I will not keep backups of my cowardice. I assume the architect identity in its totality. The old tenant has been evicted by fire. The bridge has been detonated. The wave has collapsed. The new biological configuration is lethal and definitive. To execute this in 3D matter, he resorts to his 60% mechanical keyboard. He does not press two keys, he selects the switch of the new identity. He discharges all his gravitational mass onto that one switch. He feels the mechanical resistance yield. He pushes the stem all the way down, hitting the steel plate with an undeniable acoustic click. That tactile sound is the end of the oscillation. He cuts the electrical supply to the old identity. By abandoning superposition, thermal friction disappears. The energy, CPU, the brain spent maintaining two worlds, is suddenly released. The architect experiences an overwhelming peak of quantum liquidity. Systems cool down. The signal flows pure and dry with a bass presence that makes the labyrinth vibrate. Purge of MIDI controllers, social decoupling. For the wave function collapse to be permanent, the architect must secure his perimeter. The external system, the framework, will try by all means to reopen the black box and resurrect the corpse of your old identity. It does this through social pressure and the baggage of your history. Your old friends or partners represent the old physical controllers that sent signals to your old software. They are used to pressing certain pads on your behavior to get a predictable response. for you to listen to complaints or lower your standards to make them feel comfortable. They want their old you back. The architect executes the purge of incoming connections. He assimilates that he cannot maintain a clean signal if he remains connected to the local network of the past. He applies a ruthless parametric isolation. When an old friend tries to communicate, the architect ignores the input signal. He maintains a static gaze and a pillar posture. He responds with a detachment so cold that the interlocutor recoils, terrified. The interlocutor perceives that the organism in front of them is no longer the person they knew. It is a titanium battleship that has supplanted the old tenant. The architect does not apologize for changing. Apologizing for evolving is an act of treason against his empire. The debtor would say, "Sorry, I'm going through changes." The architect says nothing. He simply occupies the spatial volume with his new density, forcing the framework to accept his terms. He disconnects all USB cables from external controllers. No one on Earth, under any emotional excuse, has administrator privileges to alter the parameters of the central synthesizer of his identity. He is a closed system, self-contained and unhackable by the ghosts of his former social circle. Absorption of absolute fear, the ice baptism. The last obstacle in destroying thermal superposition is the panic of the unknown. Killing your old identity means entering territory where no one knows you and you have no safety net of social approval. The entire burden of proof falls 100% on your execution capacity. The ordinary individual flees from this cold. The architect seeks it with greed and executes the ice baptism. He understands that the anxiety felt upon abandoning the old identity is not a warning. It is the physical sensation of wires reconnecting on the motherboard of a god. He welcomes the chill. When you feel you are becoming completely alone because your new standards have driven away the mediocre biomass, do not seek the warmth of the herd. Embrace tactical hypothermia. Plunge into absolute zero. In thermodynamic physics, 0 Kelvin is the state where erratic movement stops. Chaos reaches minimum value. In the cybernetics of being, emotional absolute zero is the state of perfect immutability where neither success nor attack can alter the architect's pulse. By killing his old self and entering absolute zero, he becomes thermodynamicamente untouchable. The labyrinth cannot burn him with indecision's friction. He has become a quantum supercomputer operating in cryogenic cooling chambers, processing trillions of conquest calculations per second without emitting a single drop of sweat or a single complaint. He is the cold logic of the first cause, operating in the silence of the deep void. Final calibration, identity murder protocol and state consolidation. To forge the massive and unshakable density of a master architect, you must today install a regime of absolute tyranny over your personal definition. Stop trying to harmonize the weakness of your past with the greatness of your future. Operate as a cleanup squad that purges corrupt code without mercy. The process demands an immediate, traumatic, and definitive intervention on your psyche's core, executing the identity murder protocol in 3 unnegotiable phases. Step 1. Disconnection of obsolete hardware. Input blackout. I declare an absolute prohibition on feeding the past identity. Audit your routine. Disconnect those wires today. Unsubscribe from the vices that sedated your mediocrity. Delete the numbers of parasitic nodes. Stop using the clothes that made you invisible. Execute a total blackout on any data source that tries to activate your weakness patch. The synthesizer of your life has changed memory banks. Step 2. Public coup de grace. 3D phase rupture. Taking the decision in the dark is not enough. Matter must register the impact. Perform a 3D irreversible act that makes returning physically impossible. Invest all capital in the project that terrifies you but guarantees sovereignty. Execute a cold, unshakable declaration of independence before the labyrinth's hierarchs. Burn the bridge while you are still crossing it. By eliminating the escape route in the physical world, you force your biological system to abandon thermal superposition and redirect all energy toward frontline annihilation. Step 3. Thermal anchoring, tolerance to freezing vacuum. Once the murder is consummated, the silence will be sepulchral. You will experience noise's absence as a terrifying hum. The ego will mourn its comfort. I forbid mourning. Apply thermal anchoring in absolute zero. Sit in the command chair. See that your hands are clean of indecision's blood. Breathe the sterile acoustics of your new room. Do not fill this vacuum with distractions. Hold the pressure of silence. Absorb the radioactivity of being completely alone at the top. In this state, your brain's resistance drops to zero, allowing superconductivity. Chapter 7. The BPM of Chaos Frequency Synchronization. In the immense, intricate, and suffocating architecture of human consciousness, there exists a torture designed not to stop the prisoner, but to exhaust him until his own tendons fracture from friction. To the erratic, docile, and terrified specimen wandering through the labyrinth, the framework has inoculated a rhythmic virus. This virus is a neurobiological urgency that forces him to run without direction. We shall call this trap of perpetual acceleration the mirage of external urgency. Observe the X-ray of the captive in his kinetic collapse. The individual wakes up in his holographic cell. Before his feet touch the floor, the labyrinth emits its signals. A crisis in financial markets, a flood of high-priority emails, the collective hysteria of social media, the excessive demands of a boss operating from panic, or the flammable drama of a toxic relationship. Everything around him moves at a dizzying speed. The individual, infected by the illusion that the outside dictates survival, panics. He feels he is falling behind. His primitive brain injects torrents of cortisol and adrenaline into his bloodstream. Under the hypnosis of this mirage, the individual assumes the only way to survive the labyrinth is to match the speed of its moving corridors. He quickens his pace. He begins to multitask frantically. He responds to messages while eating, planning the future while solving the present, running from one side to another with short breath and wide eyes. In the eyes of the burnout culture and corporate slaves, this behavior is glorified. They call it being productive, having drive, or keeping up with the market rhythm. The cognitive trap has closed over his internal clock with terrifying precision. What this organism ignores, with a cybernetic ignorance that guarantees the total disintegration of his empire before he even lays the foundations, is that reactive speed is not efficiency. It is the mathematical proof that you have lost control. The prisoner believes that by running faster, he is dominating the labyrinth. Thermodynamic reality is that the labyrinth is using him as a cheap battery. When you react to others' emergencies and move at the speed the environment demands, you are not advancing toward the exit. You are being dragged by a conveyor belt. You are headed directly toward the shredder of irrelevance. As long as the human being continues to believe that the world's time is his own time, he will remain an epileptic puppet dancing to a music he did not compose. He will live crashing into holographic walls, deaf to the fact that absolute monarchs never run to catch up. They walk with a slowness so dense, icy, and heavy that the entire history is forced to stop, sit on the ground, and wait for the monarch to finish speaking. The physics of the labyrinth, the source code. To dismantle the blasphemy of external urgency and awaken to the temporal tyranny of the master architect, we must abandon traditional time management and analyze human interaction using the laws of oscillator physics and the synchronization architecture of a state-of-the-art digital audio workstation, DAW. The entire universe is a field of pulsating frequencies. Each event, person, and ecosystem operates under a BPM, beats per minute. In sound physics and horology, there is a mechanical phenomenon discovered in the 17th century known as entrainment or frequency synchronization. If you place dozens of disordered pendulums on a moving surface, they will eventually synchronize with the pendulum that possesses the greatest mass and moment of inertia. The dominant oscillator subdues the minor oscillators. In the vital stock market, the framework is a gigantic, heavy, and chaotic metronome. It emits a master clock signal at a frantic, erratic, and panic-filled BPM, let's say 160 BPM of pure three-dimensional hysteria. The prisoner is a minor oscillator. In the configuration of his own nervous system, he has left the external sync option enabled. By doing so, he allows the labyrinth to dictate the rhythm. Observe the disaster in the source code. When you configure your mental door to be a slave to society's clock, you lose control over your own effects and signal processing. In high-resolution audio, elegance and impact depend on the exact calculation of delay times based on the BPM. The formula is pure mathematics. You divide 60,000 milliseconds by the BPM to find the exact duration of a quarter note, ensuring the echo of your action falls perfectly on the beat. But the captive, synchronized with the 160 BPM chaos of the framework, sees all his algorithms collapse. His delay times become extremely short, frantic, and cluttered. When the prisoner executes an action, the echo bounces immediately, crashing into the next action in a mass of acoustic mud. There is no space. There is no air between the kicks of his will. His decision-making becomes a blind machine gun burst. The individual suffers from constant phase cancellation. He tries to speak, but the noise of his own haste cancels the weight of his words. He tries to think, but the external metronome pushes his thoughts off the quantization grid, making him sound out of time, clumsy, and desperate. The Labyrinth feeds on this entrainment. It knows that as long as it keeps your heart rate high and your brain operating in high-frequency beta waves, alert and anxiety, you will never have the bandwidth to access alpha or theta frequencies, the deep flow states where the code of reality can be rewritten. By hijacking your BPM, the control system ensures you remain a worn-out gear, spinning at maximum speed until friction melts the engine and reduces you to ashes. The breakout command, the system hack, the transmutation to the unshakable majesty of the master architect, demands the act of physical and cybernetic rebellion most terrifying for the biomass, absolute rhythmic disobedience. The architect assimilates with icy lucidity that the urgency of others never constitutes an emergency for his empire. He repudiates the entrainment of the environment. He understands that the organism that dictates the tempo is the organism that governs the universe. He assumes the execution of temporal sovereignty, the hijacking of the tempo, and the establishment of the internal master clock. Imagine the architect entering the epicenter of a conflict. The corridors spin around him, the market collapses, his rivals run. His 3D team demands answers in milliseconds. The metronome of external reality hammers his eardrums at 160 BPM, demanding he match the speed, panic, sweat, and run. The architect stops all his biomechanical machinery dead in its tracks. He isolates his command console. He does not operate his existence using a gigantic piano full of distractions. His interface is ballistic, purged of fat. His hands rest with static firmness on a 60% mechanical keyboard. He uses a compact 25-key tactical controller designed with high-resistance pads. It is the exact hardware needed to emit commands without latency. From this minimalist station, the architect executes the definitive command: deactivate external sync, ext-sync off. In a single microsecond, he cuts the invisible MIDI cable that connected his brain to society's clock. His mind stops receiving the world's panic signal. Temporal silence floods his vault. And then, with the slowness of a white dwarf star spinning in the void, the architect sets his own master clock. He sets his internal BPM to a brutal, heavy, crushing, and glacial cadence, 60 beats per minute, the rhythm of ice, the rhythm of apex predators who have no natural predators to flee from. With this new dictatorial tempo, the architect recalculates all delay times based on his own BPM. Now, the echoes of his decisions have room to breathe. If the world throws an attack, the signal enters his processor, but the architect does not respond immediately. He lets the signal transit through the long, dark cavern of his recalibrated delay. He applies a calculated silence. And when he finally decides to respond, his answer falls exactly on the downbeat, with a mass and gravitational force so monstrous that the whole room trembles. Here, the supreme alchemy occurs. By refusing to accelerate, the architect reverses the phenomenon of entrainment. Since the ontological density and gravitational mass of his absolute zero are infinitely superior to the fragile and noisy chaos of the people around him, physics demands balance. Reality has no choice but to submit. The architect walks toward the problem with a geometric slowness. By doing so, he forces the entire labyrinth to slow down to synchronize with him. People who were running around him begin to speak slower, intimidated by his heavy cadence. The manageable crisis stops. The walls of the labyrinth cease their spinning and surrender to the rhythmic tyranny. The expropriation of frequency, the phase assault. To sustain the hijacking of the tempo without being overrun by external inertia, the architect must master an aggressive technique, the expropriation of frequency. The debtor who tries to stay calm usually adopts a defensive attitude. He tries to block the world's noise, closing his eyes and waiting. In metaphysical economics, passive defense is a slow capitulation. If you do not emit a wave strong enough, the external wave will eventually penetrate your shields. The architect does not defend, he expropriates. When chaos tries to inject its shrill frequency, he activates his central synthesizer. He doesn't turn a deaf ear. He analyzes the attack's frequency, the haste, the pressure, and through tactile pressure on his 60% console, generates a deep subsonic square wave frequency that completely suffocates the attacking wave. He overwrites the input. If a partner or competitor enters at 180 BPM, firing words and demanding immediate actions, the architect does not ask him to calm down. Asking for calm is granting authority. The architect executes a phase drop. He remains in absolute silence, holding the gaze with reptilian coldness. He stays anchored in his chair as if bolted to the earth's core. He lets the individual fire his entire magazine of anxiety. And when the other runs out of oxygen and pauses, the architect responds with a volume slightly lower than normal, forcing the other to lean in and sharpen his ear. This collision of waves is devastating. The scared partner, high frequency, low mass, crashes against the architect's wall of ice, low frequency, infinite mass. Acoustic masking destroys the adversary's hysteria. Kinetic energy is absorbed by the architect's vacuum. The frequency has been expropriated. The quantized loop, the grid discipline. The temporal sovereignty of the architect is not just for crises, it is the underlying infrastructure of his daily routine. The prisoner lives off chaotic inspiration. If he feels motivated, he works fast. If he feels depressed, he stops. His performance graph is a short-circuiting wave. The architect operates under the quantization grid discipline. In high-resolution music production, quantization is the process of millimetrically adjusting notes to an exact temporal grid, ensuring every rhythmic impact is mathematically perfect without weak human fluctuations. The architect quantizes his existence. He has extirpated motivation from his source code, considering it a slave emotion. He has configured his tactical command block so that routines of physical hypertrophy and commercial execution fall exactly on the downbeats every single day. He wakes up at the same temporal coordinate with the precision of a snare hit. He executes his financial assault at the exact point on the grid, ignoring whether he feels like it or not. By sustaining this unshakable groove over months and years, the architect generates massive leverage. Reality, observing an organism that hits the anvil of matter with such algorithmic and rhythmic perfection, develops an addiction to his signal. Resources and opportunities align on the grid to intercept his march, because the universe always rewards the Swiss clock of empire over the broken pendulum. Final calibration, the temporal hijack protocol and the glacial clock. To forge the abyssal, lethal, and calculating rhythm of a master architect, you must today install a regime of absolute insubordination against the world's haste. Stop treating others' time as a search warrant against your peace. Treat your own BPM as martial law. The process demands an immediate intervention. Step 1. Kinetic panic interception, turning off the MIDI slave. I declare an absolute prohibition on matching the speed of external chaos. Haste is the smell of blood that attracts predators. Audit your nervous system. When you feel the biological impulse to speed up, activate the rail brake. Take your hands off the keyboard. Step away from the screen. Identify that speed impulse as the framework's clock trying to enslave your sequencer. Turn off the receiver. Physically force your limbs to move underwater. Break the mechanical connection between their urgency and your muscles. Step 2. Recalculating sovereign delay, the equation of silence. Once the body has stopped accelerating, you must restructure the audio of your response. Do not react on the weak beat of others' panic. Access the 25-key console of your will. Calculate delay based on your glacial BPM. If someone asks an aggressive question, apply the tyranny of the pause. Introduce a delay of 5 or 10 full seconds before opening your mouth. Maintain absolute eye contact without blinking, absorbing the energy. Let the silence become unbearable. Only then, execute the note on the synthesizer. Step 3. Gravitational entrainment, imposing the groove. It is not enough to protect your rhythm. You must force the world to dance to the melody of your march against mediocrity. Use gravitational entrainment. Make your movements deliberate. If you speak, use the downward inflection. Each statement must land like a granite block dropped from a third floor. Do not give hurried explanations. If someone tries to rush you, stare at them and continue exactly at the same glacial cadence as before, proving their haste lacks jurisdiction. You will force the ecosystem to submit to your metronome. Chapter 8. The Illusion of Space, the Mind's Wallpaper. In the immense, dark and calculated architecture of human consciousness, the control system does not always need to use the friction of time or the thundering noise of the past to stop the prisoner. There exists a much more elegant, sterile, and devastating prison. It is a prison that requires no physical bars, no guards, nor steel chains. It is built by exploiting the deepest vulnerability of the human visual cortex. We shall call this geometric and two-dimensional trap the mirage of the solid border. Observe the radiography of the captive at the limits of his own perimeter. The individual, driven by an ephemeral burst of motivation, decides it is time to expand. He advances through the corridors with the intention of conquering a market or executing a work of supreme creativity. But reaching the border of his comfort zone, he stops dead. Before his eyes, the labyrinth has erected a colossal wall. The individual scans the wall. Socially, it appears as a lack of credentials or rejection. Financially, the wall presents itself as market saturation or the mathematical impossibility of competing with giants. The prisoner approaches the holographic wall. He trembles. Conditioned by decades of systemic terror, his biological brain processes an imaginary touch. He feels the cold of the concrete and its rough texture. He retreats, defeated, and murmurs the oldest and most pathetic excuse of the biomass. I have reached my limit. This barrier is insurmountable. Physical space does not allow me to advance further. In the eyes of condescending society, this prisoner is a sensible individual who knows his own limits. The framework rewards him with the sedation of comfort, validating his belief that there are places in the 3D universe to which he simply has no right to access. The cognitive trap has closed with the silent perfection of an optical guillotine. What this organism ignores is that the wall that just stopped him lacks atoms. It has no mass. It has no gravitational weight. It is a simple dynamic wallpaper rendered by his own nervous system to terrify him. The individual is a victim of an optical illusion generated by his own biological GPU. The labyrinth did not build that wall to keep him out. His mind built it to keep him in. As long as the human being continues to believe that social obstacles, herd rejections, or fears of public exposure are solid concrete barriers, he will remain a voluntary inmate in a prison without doors. He will live measuring his cell, blind to the fact that the absolute monarch simply adjusts the rendering code. The physics of the labyrinth, the source code. To dismantle the blasphemy of spatial limitation, we must analyze the visual processing of reality using the architecture of 3D engines and collision physics. Quantum physics has demonstrated that solid matter is a thermal illusion. An atom is 99.9999% empty space. Every contact is, at its root, information processing. Your mind operates exactly like the physics engine of a high-resolution simulator. In a 3D digital environment, space is composed of empty polygons. For a polygon to look like a stone wall, the engine applies a high-res texture. To prevent the player from passing through, programmers add a math parameter called a collision mesh. The labyrinth in which you wander works exactly under this same source code. When you try to leave the safety zone the framework designed for you, your social strata, your income limit, your primitive brain's alarm system activates. The brain hates the caloric expenditure of exploring unknown territories. To stop your advance and force energy conservation, your mind orders the rendering engine to project a frontal wall. Your mental GPU takes an empty polygon in the 3D space of your future and covers it with terrifying wallpaper. It uses the scariest textures from your history, the scornful faces of detractors. It projects this high-resolution loop directly onto the quantum probability field before you. But here lies the most beautiful design flaw. The prisoner's mind can render the texture of terror, but it lacks the thermodynamic capacity to generate a real collision mesh in the outside world. The wall of rejection has no collision. The wall of creative block has no physical density. The wall of social status is a translucent hologram. The prisoner stops because his visual system reports a wall and his biological system activates an automatic engine brake, panic, doubt, and procrastination. The captive assumes the wall rejected him, when in the strict reality of the source code, he himself pressed the brake 5 centimeters from the hologram because he got scared of the pixels. The Labyrinth is a masterpiece of spatial deception. It knows that 99% of the biomass lacks the emotional absolute zero. The breakout command, the system hack, the transmutation to the master architect demands the most unnatural act of perceptual violence, optical indifference. The architect assimilates that believing what his eyes see in moments of terror is an act of treason against his own root directory. He repudiates the geometric illusion. He understands that if the wall has no mass, trying to beat it down is a waste of energy. He assumes the execution of spatial sovereignty, script overwriting, and holographic penetration. Imagine the architect approaching the forbidden perimeter. He has just launched a massive commercial offensive. Suddenly the rendering engine detects the threat and raises the wall of impossibility. The projection is terrifying. Statistics indicate defeat is certain. The acoustic noise of the wall simulates an industrial shredder. The biological instinct screams to stop. The architect stops the blinking of his eyes. He isolates his visual cortex. Instead of retreating or seeking a side door, he executes the optical saturation protocol. He stands 30 centimeters from the false wall. He does not hit it. He does not scream. The architect plunges into emotional absolute zero and simply stares. He applies a cold gaze. He maintains uninterrupted eye contact. When you force a graphics engine to render a complex object for too long, while the camera remains absolutely still, you reveal the system's imperfections. The architect stares at the hologram of his ruin until the simulation's graphics card starts to experience lag. By not receiving an emotional response, the labyrinth loses its feedback source. The projection loses energy. The architect begins to see the pixels. He notes how the wall's texture stretches at the corners. He discovers the total absence of the collision mesh. Then he emits the straight-line advance command. He does not run to break the wall. That would validate its solidity. He simply takes a step forward. He forces his biological mass to pass through the hologram. The crossing is an event of perfect asymmetry for consciousness. He feels the image of rejection pass through him, but there is no physical crash. The wallpaper breaks into digital static, revealing that on the other side of that supposedly insurmountable wall existed only an immense, empty, and glorious illuminated corridor waiting to be conquered. The labyrinth evaporated the millisecond the first cause decided the wall was structurally irrelevant. Installing the sovereignty engine, re-rendering the environment. Passing through the hologram is only the first phase. If the architect simply moves on leaving the broken walls behind, the system will regenerate the textures in the next hallway. The architect did not come to survive the labyrinth. He came to expropriate the intellectual property of the source code. Once he has passed the space illusion, the architect accesses the environment's command terminal and executes script overwrite. The prisoner walks through hallways whose walls are painted by society's fears. The architect deletes those texture files. He loads the textures of his absolute domain. How is this new environment rendered? Through the imposition of radioactive spatial certainty. The architect projects onto the empty walls of the universe the hyper-realistic, relentless, and mathematical image of his own victory. He does it like a civil engineer driving titanium stakes into the ground. He renders the blind respect of his adversaries and the infinite liquidity of his vaults. By sustaining this projection with the massive voltage of his absolute zero, the architect hacks the local server of reality. The framework, lacking the force to resist such a high-density overwrite, cedes control. When the architect walks through the 3D world again, he no longer finds walls of rejection. The external ecosystem now reproduces the wallpaper he himself designed. His allies and enemies perceive the space around him as a minefield owned by the monarch. He is now the master server of the simulation. Immunity to fall simulators, controlled freefall. Another tool the Labyrinth uses is the mirage of the fall. When the prisoner takes a risk and loses status, the visual system renders a black pit beneath his feet. He feels he is falling into the void and enters biological panic, willing to accept any humiliating deal to get the floor back. The architect neutralizes this by installing the virtual gravity immunity protocol. He understands that a financial fall does not involve gravitational acceleration. Your body is not falling off a cliff, you are sitting in a chair, processing information. The abyss is another wallpaper on the floor. Faced with the supposed precipice of ruin, the architect does not try to grab the edges. He executes the jump into the holographic void with his hands in his pockets. He closes his eyes, slows his BPM to a glacial cadence, and observes the fall with absolute disdain. He discovers there is no impact. There is no bottom. The abyss was simply a phased transition between his previous comfort and his new state of predatory lethality. By refusing to react to the panic of the fall, the architect lands in milliseconds on a quantum concrete surface much denser and more exclusive than the one before. Final calibration, optical piercing protocol, and overwriting. To forge the X-ray vision of a master architect, you must today install a regime of visual tyranny over your own environment. Stop treating the limitations you see as geographical borders. Treat them as rice paper screens that a simple sociopathic shove can destroy. The process demands an immediate intervention. Step 1. Pixel scanner. Visual desaturation. I declare an absolute prohibition on retreating before an immaterial barrier. When facing a massive obstacle, stop your engines. Stand 10 centimeters from the terror. Activate the pixel scanner. Look at the situation stripped of emotional volume. Observe the individual who intimidates you not as an industry giant, but as a biological organism composed of carbon and fear of failure. Desaturate the colors of the hologram. Force the illusion to show its digital seams until fear becomes forensic curiosity. Step 2. Collision test. Step through the hologram. Step. In a state of emotional absolute zero, take the step. Do not run. Do not close your eyes. Take the steps slowly, feeling the weight transfer in your heels. Smoke the hologram. Feel physically how the supposed concrete wall offers zero molecular resistance. The wall reveals it never existed. You are the mass. Step 3. New code injection. Environment overwrite. Having passed the wall is just the start. Access your mind's tactile command console and inject the new rendering code. Impregnate that space with the wallpaper of your absolute monopoly. Decree. This sector of the labyrinth is purged of illusions. As of this second, the geometry of this hallway obeys my thermodynamic rules. Move your body and project your voice as if the entire universe were a VIP lounge rented exclusively for your enjoyment, forcing the environment's atoms to align millimetrically with the icy and perfect arrogance of your projection. Chapter 9. The Quantum Leap, Piercing Through Matter. In the immense, dark, and icy architecture of human consciousness, the most maddening prison is not the one that immobilizes you, but the one that forces you to walk infinitely without ever reaching your destination. To the docile specimen wandering this simulation, the control system has inoculated a conceptual virus, the mirage of sequence. Observe the radiography of the captive in his funeral march. The individual establishes a high-resolution goal to found a commercial empire or reach absolute physical sovereignty. The goal shines in the distance. Immediately, the framework delivers the map of defeat. Biomass culture whispers the lie of the trajectory, step by step. You must pay the novice's price, climb the ladder rung by rung, and suffer the process. Distance equals speed multiplied by time. The prisoner, conditioned by Newtonian physics, accepts the dogma. He assumes his life is a horizontal timeline. He believes he is mathematically obliged to bleed through every letter of the alphabet. In the eyes of slave society, this individual is a resilient worker. The cognitive trap has closed, turning his ambition into a life sentence. What this organism ignores is that the linear journey is the most expensive tax of the simulation. By accepting it, the prisoner voluntarily submits to the thermal friction of the corridors. Every step consumes his ATP energy and exposes him to distractions. The system adores linear progress because it is predictable and seizable. As long as the human believes he must walk around the walls instead of through them, he will remain a lab rat. The first cause does not wait. It alters the code and materializes on the throne. The physics of the labyrinth, the source code. To dismantle the blasphemy of sequential progression, we must analyze identity displacement using quantum mechanics and digital production interfaces. The labyrinth has deceived you into thinking you are a solid mass. In classical physics, if you throw a ball against a steel wall without enough energy, it bounces. No exceptions. But in the subatomic realm, reality operates under a darker code. There is a phenomenon called quantum tunneling. When a particle faces a barrier, it lacks the force to cross. It does not surrender. Because the particle is a wave function of probability. Quantum math dictates it can suddenly be on the other side. The electron simply disappears from point A and materializes instantly at point Z, piercing solid matter like a ghost. It has borrowed energy from the vacuum. Your I am is a high-density wave function. The walls of your stagnation are simple holographic projections, a loop wallpaper on your biological monitor. We can observe the stupidity of linear travel in how the prisoner operates his mental digital audio workstation, DAO. The prisoner lives in the arrangement view. He watches his life as a horizontal line. To reach the chorus of his success at minute 4, he believes he must passively listen to minutes 1, 2, and 3. The master architect repudiates the timeline. He knows arrangement view is a prison. He changes the interface to session view or clip launch mode. The architect does not drag the cursor. He connects a tactical MIDI controller directly to the motherboard of the universe. This controller is a grid of velocity-sensitive pads. On one of those pads, the architect has mapped the mastered audio file of his sovereign identity. When he desires that state, he does not walk toward it. He does not listen to the previous minutes. He simply lifts his finger, plunges his consciousness into absolute zero, and hits the pad with crushing force. The clip fires instantly. The state of power plays in real time, without load times or progress bars. The architect has executed quantum tunneling. He has dematerialized his identity in the position of lack and materialized it immediately in abundance, hacking the graphics engine and leaving classical laws looking at a void. The breakout command, the system hack, the transmutation to the first cause, demands the most radioactive act of metaphysical pride, the absolute eradication of becoming. The architect assimilates that gradual evolution is arms the system gives to cowards who fear instant greatness. He repudiates the verb to arrive. If you are trying, you are a beggar. He assumes the execution of identity teleportation. Imagine the architect at the lowest point of a crisis. The labyrinth shows him a 10-year staircase to recover. The framework demands he bow his head and start walking. The architect does not take a single step. He disconnects the sensors that bind him to his current spot. He does not say, "I will work hard to be a titan in 5 years." That is automaton junk code. The architect stops the reality rendering engine and emits the teleportation directive. He declares in his mind with a crackling down talk. The illusion of space and time is revoked. I cancel the trajectory. I am not learning. I am not in a recovery phase. From this microsecond, I assume the mass, density, and lethality of the entity that has already conquered the empire. The future is a hologram. I teleport to the final coordinate. The wave function has collapsed. I am the first cause. This is a ballistic hardware rewrite. To make it work, the architect uses the 60% mechanical keyboard interface. This format lacks arrow keys. The architect cannot walk sideways or backtrack. His only option is to enter direct terminal commands. He types the exact syntax of his new identity and presses enter. He commits the code. In that instant, thermal destabilization occurs. The architect forces his body into the posture of final victory. He expands his thorax and anchors his center of gravity. His voice loses any reverberation of doubt and acquires the static compression of absolute authority. The clash against the labyrinth is spectacular. The 3D environment was ready to process a loser walking slowly. Suddenly, the signal changes. The system detects the voltage of a crowned alpha predator. By assuming the final state without the hallway, the architect generates a causality short-circuit. The universe faces an effect without a logical prior cause. Since the architect's quantum density is superior to the labyrinth's fragility, reality collapses in his favor. People who looked down on him yesterday pull away today, feeling his radioactive presence. Contracts that would take years close in minutes. He altered his frequency until the wall stopped resisting. Extirpation of imposter syndrome, autonomous authority. To sustain teleportation, the architect must uninstall the imposter syndrome plugin. When the prisoner jumps to power without time of service, the herd attacks. A voice says, "You don't deserve this. You're a fraud." The debtor, hearing this, panics. His density drops to 0, and the tunneling fails. The architect executes an authority audit. He assimilates that authority is not a prize for good behavior. It is spatial volume hijacked by brute force of conviction. Titles and credentials are fake wallpapers invented by automatons. The architect does not suffer from the syndrome because he rejects the court. To feel like an imposter, you must believe system guardians are superior entities. The architect scans them. They are scared mammals in expensive suits using keyboards full of escape keys. Understanding the world's throne is always empty. The architect takes his place at the table of gods without apology. He is the galaxy's greatest imposter and takes pride in it. He understands reality is a consensual scam. The true crime is staying at the door trembling for a ticket. The architect forges the key with the source code of his own immutability. When the door opens, physical reality must legalize his occupation. Sustaining the frequency, the closed loop. The quantum leap is a millisecond act of violence. Sustaining it requires the thermal discipline of a fusion reactor. Once the architect materializes on the other side, the labyrinth will try to push him back through microaggressions. It will try to make him react from fear, doubt, or haste again. The architect installs the continuous authentication loop. He uses the acoustics of absolute zero to audit every action. He asks, "Is my response congruent with the owner of the empire, or does it smell like the slave I used to be?" If he detects a leak, he applies immediate compression. He stays cold. By holding this frequency without wavering for 72 critical hours, the cementation of matter occurs. The labyrinth's atoms, confused by this sudden monarch, cool and crystallize around the architect's new identity. The leap becomes permanent. The old identity is erased from the cache. Final calibration, the asymmetric leap protocol and dematerialization. To forge the teleportation capacity of a master architect, you must today install a regime of absolute tyranny over your conception of time. Stop treating your life as a 1,000-step staircase. Treat it as a plain text config file where you can modify your XYZ coordinates with one terminal order. The process demands an immediate intervention executing the asymmetric leap protocol. Step 1. Disconnecting the timeline. Cursor shutdown. I declare an absolute prohibition on using the word try. The language of progress is the labyrinth's anchor. Audit your internal narrative today. Isolate your goal. Erase the intermediate hallway from your brain. Do not think about study hours or gradual savings. Turn off the arrangement view. Keep only the initial audio block, where you are, and the final MIDI pad, where you want to be. View the gap as a rendering error you can completely ignore. Step 2. Imposing the final state, hitting the controller. Execute tunneling without warning. Do not wait for tomorrow morning. Magic operates in the now. Assign sovereign identity to a tactical switch. Press the button. From your next interaction, assume that identity in its totality. Speak with gravity. Speak with the economy of words and the terrifying silence of someone with millions in the bank, even if you are in the red. Walk as if you own the building. This is not acting, it is the ballistic imposition of your frequency. By injecting this density, you force the universe to recalculate its math. Step 3. Maintaining frequency. Return loop closure. The labyrinth will test your leap. It will send a stimulus to make you react like the slave you were, a rejection or an insult. Apply the return loop closure. When the test hits, do not blink. Maintain emotional absolute zero. Stay unmoved. If you react with anger, your frequency drops and you are thrown back to the start. Process the insult with the sterile boredom of a monarch looking at an insect hitting the glass. Your immutability is the seal that legalizes your new position. Your sovereignty over matter has been successfully compiled. Chapter 10. The Death of the Minotaur. The Final Confrontation. In the most abyssal and darkest depths of the mental architecture, after having annihilated the interference, silenced the echo of the past, crossed the spatial holograms, and dominated the teleportation code, the prisoner finally reaches the epicenter of his own consciousness. The center of the labyrinth. It is the place where all lines of code converge, and where the three-dimensional air becomes heavy, unbreathable, and charged with the static electricity of the definitive confrontation. The individual who has survived to this point, whom the framework can no longer deceive with cheap illusions, prepares for war. He has unsheathed his will, compressed his signal, and is ready to face the architect of his prison. We shall call this last and most devastating illusion the mirage of the external enemy. Observe the radiography of the captive in the final chamber. The individual enters the great hall expecting to find the Minotaur. His primitive brain projects the image of the supreme beast. The prisoner believes the final boss of this macabre video game is an entity alien to him. He searches the shadows, and his mind renders the monster using residual fears. For some, the Minotaur is the financial system. For others, it is ruthless competition. The prisoner raises his holographic sword and launches the attack. He begins to strike the shadows. He denounces the system. He fights furiously against competitors. In the eyes of rebellion culture, this individual is a warrior. The system applauds his bravery, while secretly feeding on his exhaustion. The cognitive trap has closed for the last time, and it is the perfect guillotine. What this organism ignores, with a forensic blindness that ensures he dies of exhaustion 1 millimeter from total freedom, is that in the exact center of the labyrinth, there is absolutely no one else. There are no conspiracies. There is no cruel God judging his steps. The 3D universe is completely empty of intentions. It is an inert, mute, and blind canvas. The prisoner is punching the air, wasting his kinetic energy fighting mirrors. As long as humans believe their jailer is an external force, they will remain a glorified slave. He will consume his CPU in wars that cannot be won because the enemy has no atoms. He will cry in frustration, seeing that for every blow, the system seems to grow stronger, deaf to the fact that the beast that has tortured him all his life, the architect who designed the walls, breathes exactly where he does. The physics of the labyrinth, the source code. To dismantle the blasphemy of external blame, we must dissect the mind using forensic systems, engineering, and elite MIDI programming. The Minotaur is not a person. In the physics of your source code, the Minotaur is your biological ego. It is the oldest, most cowardly survival algorithm on your motherboard. The ego is a security script designed to keep you alive by saving energy and avoiding pain. Here lies the darkest secret. The labyrinth is not a punishment the world imposed on you. You built the labyrinth. Your ego built the walls of failure to protect you from the absolute terror of unconditional freedom. If the world were an open plain without walls, you would have to face the radioactive truth that you are solely responsible for your own stagnation. If you are weak on an open plain, you have no one to blame. That absence of scapegoats generates a thermal pressure that the biological ego cannot bear. Therefore, your ego compiled the labyrinth. It rendered holograms of economic crisis and projected walls of impossibility, creating a prison so perfect that now you have a noble and socially acceptable excuse for not conquering the universe. The ego locked you up to save you from the weight of the crown. We can audit this internal treason in your mental door. Throughout your life, you acquired high-level hardware. Your capacity is massive. But the ego has hijacked your MIDI mapping. It has altered your master routing. It has inserted a brick wall limiter into your master bus. In audio mastering, a limiter brutally prevents a signal from exceeding a threshold. If the signal tries to pass, the limiter crushes it without mercy. The Minotaur is that limiter in your brain. It has established a pathetically low safety threshold. Every time you try to raise your frequency, it hits. The ego limiter detects the voltage of your sovereignty and, terrified by the risk of social distortion, crushes your signal immediately. It sends thoughts of prudence and fear of judgment. It reduces your dynamic range to nothing. It keeps you sounding weak, safe, and mediocre within the limits. You believe you are fighting life's obstacles, but in the forensic reality of data, you are fighting your own security plugin. You are trying to accelerate with the handbrake on, and the black smoke of friction is what you call suffering. You are fighting a war against your own protection settings. The breakout command, the system hack, the final transmutation to the first cause, demands the darkest act of ontological violence, the suicide of the biological operator to allow the birth of the synthetic monarch. The architect assimilates that he cannot negotiate with the monster because he is the monster. He repudiates auto-acceptance. He understands that to dialogue with the ego is to drink tea with his own jailer. He assumes the execution of absolute sovereignty, self-decapitation, and root code extraction. Imagine the architect in the center. He has dropped his sword. He realizes the room is empty. In the center there is only a mirror. The mirror is connected to the reality server terminal. The architect walks toward the mirror. He does not see a human. He sees the amalgam of fear, algorithms, and survival limiters that compose the debtor, the Minotaur. The biological framework screams. The ego deploys its defensive arsenal. It injects panic into the bloodstream. It begs the architect to stop. If you kill me, you won't know who you are. We will become cold monsters. The architect does not blink. He executes a perceptive firewall over the cries of his own biology. To execute this annihilation, he accesses his command console. He places his hands on the 60% mechanical keyboard. It lacks an escape key and backspace. In this final act, he is not typing a path of flight. He is going to execute the low-level format command on his own identity. He stares into the eyes of his biological reflection in the cold, absolute zero. He declares, "Jurisdiction of survival instinct is revoked. The protection algorithm is classified as destructive malware. I am not the slave who fears. I am the void that observes. I execute the annihilation order on the historical identity. The master limiter is deactivated. The Minotaur dies now." With a heavy mechanical movement, the architect presses the final key. The switch yields, making lethal electrical contact against the motherboard. The shot is silent. There is no physical blood. What occurs is a massive ontological decompression. By deactivating the limiter, the signal skyrockets. The voltage of his true will, absolute domain, expansion without apology, floods the system, breaking the digital ceiling. The explosion destroys the hologram hardware. The labyrinth, built entirely by the projected fears of that dead ego, lacks the CPU power to continue rendering. The prison disintegrates. Before the architect's eyes, the quantum concrete walls flicker. The wallpaper of impossibility loses resolution. The hallways of guilt dissolve into green and black static and evaporate. The prison disintegrates into data dust, revealing that behind the torture, there were never walls nor enemies nor gods. Only an infinite, silent, and wonderfully empty plane remains, illuminated by the white, lethal, and unalterable glow of a monarch. He just discovered that the key to the chains was always hidden in the sociopathic act of tearing out his own biological heart. He is the master of the void. Hardware reconfiguration, direct mapping. Once the labyrinth has collapsed, the architect does not stay floating in existential emptiness. Passive enlightenment is another fraud. The architect became enlightened to expropriate the market, not to contemplate it. He must take manual control of the formatted system. he executes custom MIDI mapping. Before, the ego dictated which key activated which emotion. Now, the console is a blank canvas. The architect opens the routing matrix and assigns direct commands, eliminating latency between thought and matter. He links the main pad directly to the wave function collapse of his financial ambitions. He no longer passes through doubt. He hits the pad and executes the commercial closing with the coldness of a high-frequency algorithm. He links rotary encoders to his endocrine system. If he needs aggressiveness, he simply turns the virtual knob of testosterone, raising the gain parametrically. He links the master fader to his own presence's opacity. If he needs to be invisible to extract tactical data, he lowers the fader, becoming an acoustic ghost. If he needs to impose terror in a boardroom, he raises it to the maximum, forcing every atom to resonate with the frequency of his first cause. There is no me to be offended. There is no me to fear rejection. The biological organism has ceased to be a fragile identity to become a 3D combat exosuit, piloted from the darkness of absolute zero by an intelligence that does not feel, does not suffer, and does not negotiate. It only executes. Unshakable apathy, the monarch's void. The definitive watermark of the Minotaur's death is the state installed in the architect's nervous system. Unshakable apathy. The prisoner believed final victory would feel like a devouring fire. The architect discovers that true supremacy is boring, cold, and static. It is the absence of friction. With no ego to defend, the architect becomes hyper-lethal because he no longer cares about what the biomass values. If an investor rejects him, there is no wounded Minotaur demanding emotional revenge. There is a telemetry system processing a 404 not found error, aiming the artillery elsewhere. If the market attacks with recession, he does not cry. He adjusts his metaphysical short-selling algorithms and grows rich while the world burns. His pulse is as steady as a corpse's. This apathy is not depression. It is the ability to look at glory and death and assign them the value. 0. By reducing the universe to a canvas without emotional value, the architect acquires absolute power to paint it whatever color his tyranny pleases. He knows the world can never hurt a man who has learned to enjoy the cold radiation of his own vacuum. He is the untouchable engineer of the aftermath. Final calibration, internal execution protocol and master reset. To forge the alien immutability of a master architect, you must today install a regime of absolute tyranny over your identity narrative. Stop treating your ego as a wounded companion. Treat it as ransomware that has hijacked your greatness and demands mediocrity. The process demands terminal intervention. Step 1. Resistance identification, malware audit. I declare an absolute prohibition on blaming external entities for your walls. The universe is absolved. Audit your current labyrinth. What part of your identity requires that obstacle to exist so you don't have to act? Find the background process. Step 2. Power cut. Final task. Once the corrupt process is identified, do not try to reprogram it with kind words. Malware is not forgiven. It is deleted. Place your finger on your 60% keyboard. Select the fear and the need for approval. Execute the end task command. Feel the physical impact. Step 3. Monarchic kernel initialization, mapping the first cause. Do not leave the system empty. Simulation nature will fill the void if you do not occupy it with titanium. Load the new kernel. Map your new directives. Decree the code. This biological vehicle operates under absolute zero jurisdiction. No external enemy exists. No spatial limit exists. Reality is a blank screen subject to my keyboard's exclusive orders. I dictate the physics. I generate the matter. Rise, not as a prisoner who escaped, but as the engineer who just pressed enter and is about to delete the entire prison file with a smile. Conclusion: the architect of the new paradigm. In the suffocating and perfect silence that follows the system collapse, the digital dust settles. The prisoner has died, and with him, the largest optical illusion ever programmed into humanity's rendering engine. The labyrinth, with all its corridors of terror, echoes of childhood trauma, and its Minotaur of guilt, has been unplugged. Looking around, the individual finds no physical debris to clean because he assimilates with a frozen lucidity that there were never real bricks. All the suffering and desperation were simply the result of faulty signal routing, an excess of corrupt plugins, and a graphics card overheated by panic. You have finally crossed the threshold. You have ceased to be the lab rat that memorizes dead ends, seeking a piece of cheese or the framework's validation. By executing phase cancellation on your fears and amputating the backspace key from your command console, you have reclaimed supreme administrator privileges. You are the architect of the new paradigm. It is your era. In this new operative state, 3D reality stops being a hostile prison to reveal itself as what it always was: conscious matter. A quantum canvas, sterile and docile, that desperately waits to be molded by a will operating in the vacuum of emotional absolute zero. The universe does not hate you, it simply processes your signal. If you emit the acoustic frequency of a slave, conscious matter renders heavy chains to validate your code. But if you connect your MIDI controller directly to the core, isolating your master channel from the herd's static, and inject the radioactive voltage of a monarch matter reconfigures, atoms reorganize for you. Operating in this new paradigm demands minimalist tyranny. You no longer work with the biomass's chaotic interface. You have reduced your existence to a 60% format. There are no escape routes. Your mind is now a perfect sequencer in master session view, firing quantum probability clips in real time. You have hijacked the world's BPM. When the environment panics, you slow down. When the market doubts, you press the tactile switch with the weight of Jupiter's gravity. You have mastered the dark art of teleporting directly to the throne through wave function collapse, leaving Newtonian physics staring at the void. You no longer try to improve your life. Improvement implies the base system is broken. You have formatted the hard drive and installed a dictatorial kernel. You have understood that linear patience is for mortals, and that the tunneling effect is the only acceptable transport for the first cause. You move through walls. When a holographic obstacle projects before your eyes, you do not use a shovel. You adjust the parametric EQ of your perception, cut the fear return cable, apply an unyielding noise gate, and walk through the wallpaper of illusion like a god walking through laser projections. The world will look at you with reverential terror. The framework, used to consuming the energy of the frightened, will not know how to process an organism that emits no heat, seeks no applause, and does not flinch before the abyss. They will tempt you with the old optionality. They will offer plan Bs. But you will respond with the dense silence of one who has privatized his soul. Close the demolition manual, disconnect your interface from pure theory, and place your hands on the physical keyboard of your own existence. Feel the cold material and the absolute absence of backspace commands. Before you is not a labyrinth. There is an empty sequencer waiting for you to write the first bar of your domination. You are the architect, the engineer, and the executioner of the simulation. Conscious matter awaits your commands. Write the code. Press the button. Execute your identity with a parametric violence so majestic and lethal that the entire universe is forced to recalibrate around the thundering impact of your new truth.